I could never sleep well in hotels. I guess that's somewhat of an understatement. I could never sleep well in general, but hotels were the worst. Just the thought that the previous occupant of this bed is a complete stranger was repulsive in my mind. But that's beside the point. What I'm getting at is how this lack of sleep in hotels changed my life. Christmas. We were spending Christmas in a shitty hotel and not with family. Great. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I didn't enjoy the all-you-can-eat buffet of soggy hash browns and grits for Christmas Eve dinner. Of course, the first snow of the season had to cancel our flight down to Virginia. It was Christmas Eve, and I was trying to sleep in this bleach-saturated room. My mind was wondering what happened in here to cause such an excessive amount of bleach to be needed. The room was nothing out of the ordinary. 2 beds, one for my dad and I, and another for my sister and mom. A bathroom, and a stained microwave that looked in need of a good dusting. Somehow, I escaped the room and the stench of the bleach into a dreamless sleep. Waking up, I could tell it was early morning. My dad was next to me snoring, and he usually wakes up before 4 a.m. That is when it hit me. It's Christmas, and I was about to let this bad fortune ruin my favorite holiday. Looking across the bed at the clock to check the time is when I noticed it. The silhouette of a man about 6'3" across the room, staring at my mom sleep. Still half asleep and caught up in the moment, I couldn't help thinking of Santa Claus. I realized how stupid the thought was, and horror soon filled my head. I choked back a shriek. I knew I couldn't let him see me awake, so I quietly put my head back down, pretending to sleep. My mind was racing. Someone was in my room and I couldn't do anything. I was a scrawny 16-year-old and this man looked to be built like an ox. I wondered if I could wake my dad up in time, but I knew that wouldn't work. He slept like a rock. A bucket of water couldn't get him up fast enough. I was practically in tears. I had never felt so helpless. For a second time, I choked back a scream. He was standing next to me, and I could feel and hear his repulsive breath on my face. It smelled like he had been eating rotten meat for a week now with no thought to brush his teeth. If he didn't know I was awake, surely he did now, seeing that my face was contorted in fear. The breathing stopped, and I couldn't help the sigh of relief. I would have kicked myself, but there was no need. I heard the room door open and closed. I launched out of bed. Nothing in the room was in disarray, and my family was still asleep. That could not have been a dream. I couldn't have imagined it. Feeling awake as ever, a horrible idea popped into my head, and before I could push it away, I was pulling the door open. Glancing back to the door in order to memorize the room number, I saw the giant spray-painted black X on the door. Had I seen this without the prior experience, I probably would have thought it was just some stupid kids, but I knew better. But not enough to know what it was for. My heart skipped a beat. There he was, turning the corner at the end of the hall. Why am I doing this? I tailed him down to the parking lot. He was nowhere in sight. One moment he's walking out of the lobby, and the next he's gone. Realizing how cold it is outside in paper-thin pajamas, I returned to the lobby. No one was around. Strange. I could swear there's usually a night concierge. Adrenaline wearing off, I realized how stupid and rash my actions had been. He could have killed me. I cursed myself back up the stairs. I knew something was wrong when I got to my floor. The door to my room was wide open. I hadn't left it that way, right? I walked inside, and after a quick search of the room, I determined it's safe and my family was still asleep. I locked the door and got back into bed, though I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I listened to my dad get up, and eventually my mom followed, but I still pretended to sleep. A few hours passed, and my parents got my sister and I up. We got into the car and made our way back to the airport. Digging through my bag to grab my iPod led to the finding of something that had not been there the previous day. A note that simply held the 5 words that I still think about to this day. I knew you were awake. It's now been 2 months since the hotel experience. I'm still scared for my life, and it gets worse every day. That note that I found, it wasn't the only one. I still receive them.
We all know that magical feeling when you're 6 or even 13 years old on Christmas Day. Anything is possible when you run into your living room and see that brightly lit Christmas tree with presents stacked underneath it. The colorful designs of the wrapping paper seem so alluring and make you giggle with glee. Because then, you believe that anything could be under those layers of the wrapping paper, just waiting for you to discover it. My Christmas story is this experience, like that of any other 7-year-old child. Normally, when you open a present on Christmas Day, you expect to find something happy or positive. What I found is impossible for me to explain. Even today in my late 20s, I cannot begin to comprehend it. I woke up earlier than usual, about 8 a.m., and I ran down the stairs in my Christmas pajamas. My dad and my mom were sitting on the couch, mugs of coffee in their hands, smiling up at me. The radio was playing Jingle Bell Rock, like it does every year in my small town. On the kitchen counter waiting for me was a freshly baked pan of gingerbread cookies and milk. Just like the perfect Christmas I experienced every year. There was one thing, however, one thing that was different. There was a small box under the tree, roughly about the size of a box of pencils, with the same appearance. This present was not wrapped in the same color wrapping paper, which made me curious. Being 7 years old, I thought it was simply a special present, different from the rest. Better. I wonder what this one is, I said, picking up the small box. My parents, though, did not seem to recognize the present, almost as if they had absolutely no idea how it got underneath the tree. I rolled my eyes at them, believing that they were just pretending not to know what it was to maintain some sort of element of surprise. I took the box and peeled off the wrapping paper. But there wasn't a present in there. There was a cardboard box with my address written on it. It was a package. Now, I'm not talking about a package that you would see from like Amazon or anything. It was a package sent to me from an unidentified individual. Oddly enough, there was no return address anywhere on the package, which gave no clue as to who sent it to me. There were, however, in a dark red pen, the initials NP, scrawled on the front in signature format. I was genuinely confused at this point, as were my parents. I took a pair of scissors and cut through the tape that sealed the sides of the box and opened it. Inside the box was a letter. Not the sort of letter you would expect to come in the mail. There was no envelope. It was a traditional letter, with the paper folded neatly in half, a wax stamped seal keeping the letter closed. I broke the seal and opened the letter, and it read as such. Dear Timothy Pines, I watch you when you're sleeping. I know when you're awake. Go to sleep tonight, Timmy. And please, do not wake up for your own sake. Happy holidays. SC. I read the letter several times, trying to grasp any sort of meaning in it. But I didn't realize something until later. I looked at the bottom of the letter, and attached to it by a small piece of tape was a small razor blade. I didn't go to sleep that night. I was hysterical. My mom and dad had to stay awake with me that night and play games with me, just to get me to try to calm down in any way that they possibly could. Perhaps we really don't know what we're opening that morning of every year. Now, as years go by, I look at Christmas in a completely different perspective. Happy holidays, whoever may be reading this. I guess we really don't know what might be awaiting us underneath those layers of wrapping paper on Christmas morning.
12 seems to be the age when most kids start putting the heat on their parents about the truth behind Santa. I certainly was no exception to this rule. How are Santa's elves able to make that video game I wanted in their workshop? I thought Nintendo owned Mario. Or how about the ever-infamous visiting every house in one night question? Did the jolly man own some kind of time-extending device? Or perhaps the most obvious question of all, how could he have lived for this long? A lot of people say he trains apprentices, who take his place every few decades. Others claim he's just immortal. As for everything else, magic seemed to be the universal lie everyone had agreed on. Whatever the case, I just went with the conclusion that it was my parents doing it. Of course, they deny it and claim ignorance if I confronted them, but it wasn't enough to dissuade my beliefs. So, one Christmas Eve, when I couldn't sleep as these questions danced among my dreams of sugar cereals and new games, I decided to investigate the noises coming from my living room. This time, surely I would catch my dad or mom in the act of stowing presents under the tree. At least, then they'd let me in on the truth. But as I entered the living room, I saw a man before me that I did not recognize. He was dressed in red and white, with a slightly overweight body, and he wore a stringy, fake white beard. His hair, or what remained of it, was graying around the edges of his classic Santa hat, and his eyes were wide with fright as he dropped a present under the tree. Being the intuitive youth I was, I came to only two conclusions. Either this was a home invader stealing my family's gifts, or this was the real Santa. I opened my mouth to scream, but the man rushed towards me and covered my mouth. "Shh, shh," he said, putting a finger to his mouth, trying to smile. Tears began to roll down my cheeks. I was petrified of this man. Then slowly he took his hand away and extended it towards me. "It's all right there, little one. You know who I am, right?" I nodded, not shaking his hand back. The trembling man nodded as well, then grabbed an empty sack laying on the floor and gestured to the tree. "Look, see? I bring gifts. Now run along to bed, or I might have to put you on the naughty list." He started drifting towards the deeper, hearty voice stereotypically associated with Kris Kringle, but I wasn't fooled. Regardless, I wiped my eyes and began to step back from the living room, trying to create some distance between me and the stranger. The man simply watched, wiped his brow, and proceeded to approach the fireplace. I stopped and observed, confused as to how he was going to leave my house. But a blast of green flames erupted from the chimney, and the man fell back to the floor. I couldn't see his face, but I'm certain it was twisted in fear like my own. A massive bony hand spawned from the fire. The arm that followed was draped in raggedy fur. Then another arm, and then the skull of some wild creature with two large horns followed, nearly as large as the fireplace itself. The bones popped and snapped as it slammed its hands onto the floor. The entire monster was engulfed in the flame, yet it did not seem to burn anything in the house. "Eddie," the monster declared, speaking to what I guessed was the man on the floor. No, Eddie shouted back. "I did my part. See, 10,000 houses, just like you said, right? 10,000, I did my part. And yet you allowed a human child to see you. You know the rules. Look, I've learned my lesson. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Just let me go, please. I delivered all the..." "Let you go? Did you let that woman go, Eddie? I don't seem to recall you letting her go." This was your second chance, and you've wasted it. What are you going to do? Eddie whispered. I could make out his quaking figure being overshadowed by the creature in the fireplace. The next sound to be heard was a crunch, with a soft beginning and a snapping finish. I jumped as the sound repeated a few times, finally letting out a shaky breath. I prayed in my head that it wasn't what I thought. But when the creature reared its head towards me, I saw the red and white pants hanging from his mouth as it chewed on Eddie's corpse, then watched it slurp his legs up like strands of spaghetti. I covered my eyes and tried to tell myself it wasn't real. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. And after a quiet minute, I peeked between my fingers to see the monster staring back at me from the fireplace. The pace of my breathing now quicker and sharper. My eyes unable to escape from the grasp of those empty eye sockets. Now, run off back to bed, little one, or I might put you on the naughty list next. My legs finally found the strength to leave, and I sprinted from my parents' room, diving into the sheets with them. There wasn't a trace of the events of the night before when my family went down to the tree the next morning. There was even a little note next to an empty glass and a half-eaten cookie on the table. Have a Merry Christmas, Santa Claus. As much as I tried to take in the warm, comforting atmosphere that was Christmas Day, I couldn't stop watching the fireplace, terrified that that monster would return. At the least, now I know the truth about Santa Claus.
Run. I can't think of anything else to say other than run. But I guess for that to make sense, I'd have to go into detail about what happened 10 years ago, when I was about 8 years old. I've always loved Christmas, ever since I was able to understand the word, Christmas. Even the name sounds festive. I've grown up with every story and song about good old St. Nick, and the warm holiday imaginable. And in short, one day, I decided that I would see him for myself. As most kids with the same upbringing often considered, I prepared for at least a week, navigating around potential landmines like parents being awake, or being caught by the jolly fat man himself, or even leaving evidence that I was even there. I decided that I'd venture downstairs at 3 a.m., armed with a blanket and some black coffee to keep myself awake, although I can't stand the bitter taste, and often found myself wanting to regurgitate every time I took a sip. When the day finally came, oddly enough, I found myself hearing Santa Claus is Coming to Town, playing just about everywhere for just about as long as I could stand. I heard the lines, "He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good," over and over again. But I guess something just didn't click, and I really wish it had. I really, really wish it had. Because that night I saw something I desperately wish I could unsee. Even now, hearing the sound of sleigh bells, I reflexively recoil, as if I expect something deadly to appear consecutively. The air that night was stiff and chilly. It was coming down violently outside my window, and every step I took down the stairs revived my pulse with a renewed sense of dread. Both the dread of being caught and the dread you feel descending any flight of creaky stairs. The dread you feel when it startles you. The sudden and yet drawn-out sound that for a split second you might mistake for a human cry. And yet I continued down the stairs until I reached the place I would be hiding. A small nook between the wall and the living room, the sofa, and the radiator, from which I had anticipated being able to discreetly witness Santa's arrival. So I waited there. And I waited, and I waited. I must have been there at least my second shot of black coffee, certain that I had been there for, at the very least, 2 hours. When I glanced at the time, and to my horror, not 1 minute had passed. Not one. It was still 3 a.m., and I thought certainly the clock must have been wrong. Certainly. Yes, surely the clock was broken. I had literally been counting seconds upon minutes, waiting for anything to happen. I had almost convinced myself that time had passed, and the clock was stuck for whatever reason. I'd almost been succeeding in calming myself down when I noticed the wind had stopped. The wailing sound of the wind, which resembled a human scream, and the occasional knock of an angry gust on any of the closed windows had completely halted. It was silent. Completely silent. So silent, in fact, that I could hear all the sound of my shaking breath. A silence so loud that it accentuated the darkness. Every shadow, every dark corner seemed to reach me at once, as if trying to swallow me up too. And all I could hear was my own increasingly struggled breathing, and I stayed like that until I heard it. Something which shattered the silence, once more breaking the comfort I had settled into, and cutting through me like the jagged end of a cold knife. It was a jingle. A soft rhythmic chime set to the slightly crooked gate that sounded more like someone dragging themselves around by their elbows than like walking. My first thought was, when I heard the unmistakable chime of the sleigh bells, was that Santa was finally here. But as the sound grew closer, I noticed it was accompanied by a soft whimpering sound, which sounded close enough to a human to be recognizable, but inhuman enough for me to be unable to tell how old the voice was, or how feminine or masculine it was. My pulse quickened anew. This wasn't Santa. With each dragging step, the sleigh bells only grew louder, and the whimpering became more clear. He sees when you're sleeping. It sounded even less human than the whimpering had. The speech was broken up, distorted, like that thing spoke as if it was literally choking on its own lung. Step, chime. The darkness was swallowing me up once more, eating away at my sanity. I found it difficult to breathe. It was getting closer, and the crooked melody of the sleigh bells only grew louder. I held my breath between every pause for every step, every agonizing second before I heard the next chime. He knows when you're awake. Step, chime. He knows if you've been bad or good. It was close, so close. I didn't know where it was, but it was close. I could feel the air begging to suffocate me, each chime stealing my next breath more violently than the last. I could almost make out what it was saying now. Its voice was grossly distorted. It sounded like an animal trying to speak while choking on its own blood. Creak, chime, and with that I saw it. It finally came into view and stared straight at me, and more violently than ever. I fought to keep the coffee and my dinner down. Skin was stretched tightly over its face, gray and leathery, with its mouth twisted into a sinister smile. Or as close to a smile as it could be called. There was a hole in its lower jaw from which I saw its tongue hanging from dried blood, clinging to the lining of the cavity of its beard, sparse white hair barely clinging to its chin. From its torso all the way to its neck, the bells were wrapped around to the point where the creature so much as moved its head the wrong way. It might have accidentally garroted itself. I tried to scream, I tried to move, but the silence had already devoured my cry, and the darkness already crushed my limbs. I could only watch as the creature slowly hobbled towards me, each slower ring engraving itself into my memory as its distorted grimace widened, causing a flow of flesh-warm blood to flow from the cavity in its face. Good girls shouldn't be up at this hour. Time suddenly resumed, and in a moment, with some inhumane strength, the creature had torn me from the nook and thrown my limp, petrified body into a wall. The doors and windows clattered with the angry gust of wind, and snow billowed in from the window. The creature must have entered. Chilling my body, I tried to look up. I tried to breathe. But before I could try to cry out again, a chain of sleigh bells was wrapped around my neck. The freezing metal dug into my skin and choked me. My eyes began to roll back as I frantically grabbed at them in the darkness. And God, the ringing. I can hear them. They chimed as they cut off my air, darkening my vision, intermingled with my choked-off sobbing. The bells almost sounded like screaming, and the screaming of the bells, that which sounded like other children's all crying out together to make the bell sound. before it all faded to cold. Unconscious silence was the last thing I heard. I woke up on the cold floor with half a pitcher of coffee, clutched tightly in one hand, and the blanket wrapped around me. I exhaled quietly, relieved that it had all been a dream, and proceeded with my day as normal. I'd almost convinced myself that it had never happened. That is until my mother asked me where that bruise around my neck came from, and outside, I heard a sleigh bell ring in the darkness of the early winter morning.
When I woke up this morning, I found the house to be empty. It was strange. I seriously doubt that my family would leave for my aunt's house without me on Christmas morning. Something wasn't right. All the miscellaneously placed pictures of me that were on the walls and the hearth were gone. All their photos were still in place. Another thing that struck me as odd was the fact that there were no gifts that, just last night, were meticulously put under the tree this morning. What the hell? I thought to myself. Everything is gone, even the shit I left for my parents. Just then I heard a low guttural growl that made me practically jump out of my skin. I quickly turned my head to see my dog baring her teeth, in a semi-defensive position. She stared at me with a terrified look in her eyes as she growled. I took a step toward her and she ran into the other room as fast as she could. She did leave a nice piss stain in the carpet though. Shit, I muttered under my breath. Something definitely isn't right. I walked through the house and everything was a mess. Tables and chairs were turned over and lamps were smashed. It looked as if a tornado went through the place. I felt like shit. I guess a good analogy would be I felt as the house looked. I felt as if a cement truck had just punched me in the gut. I went upstairs to go to the bathroom and wash myself. The smell of cigarette smoke and cheap booze filled the air. I wondered what was going on. In the bathroom, I looked in the mirror and I must say I looked like a picture of the living dead. I was as white as fucking sour cream. My pupils were dilated to a size I never knew was natural. It was almost as if my eyes themselves were black. Quite disconcerted, I walked through the house at a slow pace, taking my time. I noticed that my father's black suit and tie were missing. Shouldn't be anything disturbing to me, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the bad feeling that was coming from deep within my gut. As I walked down the stairs, I looked out the window and noticed that my dad's black Cadillac was missing from the driveway. So was my mom's Chrysler. I was pissed that they just left me alone like this. Whatever. It was only 3 miles to my aunt's house anyway. I put on my jacket and I walked out the door quietly, being careful to not scare my dog more than she already was. It was a cold day, which was to be expected on a late December day in Capitol Hill, Boston. There was a mass of people congregated around the junction around 3 blocks away from my house. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the outline of a black car. It had hit the side of a 2-family house. The front half of the car was inside the damn living room. I had a natural aversion to things like that, so despite being worried about the driver and potential passengers, I kept moving. Nothing else seemed out of the ordinary on my walk. Just your typical Bostonian good morning, which is a bump in the shoulder and any of the several established cusses. I arrived at my aunt's house about 2 hours after setting off. Yes, I took my sweet time. Looking in the window, I could see several family members, nuclear family included, huddled around the table. I was mad as hell, but then I took a good, hard look at everyone inside. All of them had a somber look on their faces for such a joyous holiday. Each person also had a black suit or dress on. But then my anger had faded, and I quietly walked through the door as opposed to bursting through it, which is what I wanted to do at first. As soon as my foot crossed the threshold, a bright light enveloped me. I felt like I was drowning in light, and then everything went dark. When I came to, I walked out of my room, and there was still nothing under the tree. Both cars were still gone. I was more confused than when I woke up this morning. There was no way my parents would have brought me home and left me there to go back to my aunt's house. I decided to go back. Once again, I put on my jacket and left the house. I remembered that about 3 blocks away, there was an accident, and I figured I wouldn't be a pussy this time and check it out. The crowd was gone, and there were only 2 squad cars. One was on the corner and the other was right next to the crashed car. I walked right up to the car and was disturbed by the fact that the cop, eating a donut, and reading the Boston Globe, did not take notice of my presence despite the fact that I walked right by them. I dreaded looking inside the car and I hesitated for a few minutes. I wasn't going to let myself just walk away, even though I felt like I was about to throw up. I bent over and was horrified to see a bloody pulp of a man that looked just like me, pinned into the seat by the dashboard. Blood continued to roll down his forehead. His hand still clutched the steering wheel. White-knuckled, and a look of horror was still spread across his face. Rigor mortis is a beautiful thing. In the distance, I saw an ambulance cruising towards the car with lights flashing and the speakers occasionally letting out a beep or two. In a state of disbelief, I rushed around to the back of the car, only to be greeted by the Cadillac insignia. I rushed to the squad car and started yelling at the cop, hoping to get a response, but none came. I ran to a nearby driveway and picked up pebbles and started throwing them at the cop's window. He suddenly sat up, alert, and he turned his head in my direction. With a quizzical look on his face, he turned his head away as if he didn't see me and went back to his donuts and the morning paper. I ran as fast as I could, but I only got a few feet away when I tripped on something. As I hit the ground and lay there, a bright white light, exactly like the one from before, came over me again. It all came back to me in a flash, pulling out of the driveway, running through the red light, worried that I would be late, and getting T-boned by the damn Kia. Shielding my face with my hands from the shattered glass, trying desperately to gain control of the car again. Going through the wall of the two-family home, being pinned in my seat by the dashboard, and finally choking on my own blood as it welled up in my lungs. When I woke up this afternoon, I found the house to be empty. It was strange. I seriously doubted my family would leave me asleep while they went to my aunt's house on Christmas Day. Something wasn't right. All the miscellaneously placed pictures of me were off the walls and the hearth were gone. All of their photos were still in place. Another thing that struck me as odd was the fact that there were no gifts that, just last night, were meticulously put under the tree this morning.